Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Braden Banglin, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu or speak with a student worker after the program, such as myself. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel, and you can also access videos of past programs by visiting our channel. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid as well. After the program, we will have some times for the audience to ask questions. If you do have a question, please raise your hand, and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and just ask one brief question. If you happen to be a part of our virtual audience, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. Now, please join me in welcoming Director Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Braden, for that warm welcome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Dole Institute. Braden was one of a group of wonderful SAB students who got to interact with our visiting fellows from the BPC in a really sharp and insightful conversation about our nation's fiscal challenges. This was just last evening, so that's a wonderful part of this partnership that we're so proud to bring to the Dole Institute with our friends at the BPC. We've been developing this program really in earnest since Senators Lott and Daschle visited us last spring to help kick off the Senator's 100th birthday year, and it's been just a wonderful relationship, and we're so glad to build that with them. I want to make a couple of announcements about upcoming programs before I introduce our visiting fellow, Rachel Snyderman. Next Thursday here at the Dole Institute, we're going to be hosting a conversation with Douglas County, Kansas elections clerk, Jamie Hsu. He'll be in conversations with Kansas Secretary of State Scott Schwab. That'll be again here at the Institute at 7 p.m., talking about the state of election administration and bolstering elections administration. And that's a program in partnership with the Edward Kennedy Institute. We're so pleased to host that. On February 20th, our discussion group series for spring will kick off with our Dole Fellow, who's our County Commissioner, Karen Wiley. She'll be convening a series of conversations with support from Braden and also our other discussion group coordinator, Rachel Creighton, on sustainability in Kansas, and that's in partnership with the Rural Center. So the first event will be February 20th at 4 o'clock in the afternoon here in the Simons Media Room. So I am so pleased that, again, to have our visiting fellows, Rachel Snyderman and Emily Wielk, here with us today. Our presenter this morning will be Rachel. Rachel is Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. She's joined the BPC following federal service with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Department of Commerce, and the Office of Management and Budget. Earlier in her career, she worked for EY and Innovations for Poverty Action. She has her BA in Economics and Latin American Studies from Wellesley College and holds an MA from Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Snyderman.
Thank you. It's wonderful. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the generous opportunity to be here with you all today. And a special thank you to Audrey, Sarah Stacy, Sarah Gard, and Mark Crabtree for making this event possible, the opportunity to get outside of DC and to spend some time with you all this morning. I'm joined today by my colleague Emily Wielk, who last night we were able to bring together a group of just such bright, enthusiastic, curious college students to really talk about how their generation is going to be responsible for getting us out of the fiscal challenges that await us. And we're so really, it left me with just really budding optimism to see that they have some really bright solutions to some really dark challenges. So I want to just really quickly introduce a little bit more about myself, the Bipartisan Policy Center. I serve as the director at the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is an organization, a mission-driven organization that, I think, especially standing in this building today, holds such symbolic meaning because our organization too was founded by the late senator, along with Senator Daschle, Senator Mitchell, and Baker, to really show that as Americans, regardless of the colors of our party, the stories of our background, the experiences that we've lived, and who we represent, that Americans can come together to find common ground on the thorniest of issues that we face as a nation, that we truly can be one America. And so at the Bipartisan Policy Center in DC, our policy solutions are really formed not just on the basis of centrist policies, but trying to bring together the ideas that the best ideas and the best policy solutions that both parties represent. I like to say this in DC, but certainly when we get outside of the Beltway, we are the only organization in Washington, DC with the bipartisan in our name. I think that speaks volumes for how broken Washington is today, that there is one lone institution working to really bridge that divide and bring folks together. My goal for this discussion today is to leave you both with a sense of urgency over our fiscal outlook and the serious challenges that await, but also, again, with that sense of optimism that we heard last night. Optimism that, first and foremost, the challenges that are upon us are solvable. We have the solutions to fix them. We just need the political courage to do so. Two, that bipartisanship is a tool that can be used to solve those challenges. And third, that because of, again, we are here at an academic institution, that we have a bright, willing, able next generation who can rise to the calling of public service and help solve these challenges and find that political courage to do so. I was struck when I was coming here and reading some of the senator's old remarks, and it was really such a special treat. We were able to spend some time yesterday with Sarah Gard down in the senator's personal archive collection. And as someone who has studied fiscal policy for many years, to be able to see there was a very historic picture that he had with President H.W. Bush with a baseball bat, the deficit-busting baseball bat. And it was really quite a special treat to be able to actually see that in person yesterday. It's not every day that you can get a crowd out of the House to talk about fiscal policy and government spending and tax policy, but yet here we are. So, just a special tribute on that. But, throughout, I recognize I have many slides today. I'm going to try to not really use them. There was a lot of content on here. I'm a numbers person, but I want this to be an engaging conversation throughout. So, we'll refer back to these if we need to in the Q&A, but I'll just use them to kind of guide some of the main elements that I want to leave you with. But with that, we'll pretty much dive in. So there are a few key takeaways that I want to leave you all with today. And again, we'll have a rich discussion in the question and answer. But the first here, and again, I want to bring this back to that point of optimism. There's going to be a lot of pessimism, emanating from these numbers and slides that we're going to see, but I promise there's a rationale. The first key takeaway, the United States is on an unsustainable long-term fiscal path. When we look at the numbers, we see the headlines in Washington that, our federal debt has eclipsed $34 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office yesterday came out with a new report saying that annual deficits of $1.5 trillion are going to be the new norm. We're at a significant inflection point in our nation's history when it comes to our inability to balance our budget and to put ourselves on a sustainable fiscal path. Now, this is just a chart kind of showing that the federal public debt has truly reached levels seen only a few times in history. Particularly important because when we've seen levels of the federal debt that they're at now, it's been in periods of wartime, periods of pandemic response, But now this is projected really to be the new norm. And that's, truly important because of the fact that the economy right now is relatively strong, the outlook relatively strong as well, and that we're not in a major time of war. And so, it's with that, we need to kind of be thinking about, what does this mean? How do we design policy responses to get our fiscal outlook back on track? And I think, diving into some of the specifics here, it's important to note that, the federal government, our federal debt is just the accumulation of each and every year our inability to balance the budget. We are continually spending more on government programs and services than we're bringing in revenues to be able to finance those government services. And so as you can see from this chart too, other than some running a budget surplus at really the turn of the century, these large deficits have become really the new norm. And we've seen even from statements from Federal Chair Jerome Powell, from Secretary Yellen even earlier this week, that this unsustainable fiscal outlook should be of national attention. And our inability to really come to the table, this is not the result of one party's control of passing tax cuts or increasing government spending, but these deficits have been run under presidents, under Congresses, held in both parties over the past years. And so it's really the collective responsibility of both parties, whether to come to the table and to find that sustainable path forward. Now, I will also note that it's important when we think about the ability to borrow, the ability to rack up these deficits. It's not necessarily always a bad thing, right? Take the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. The United States was able to immediately get support out to the millions of Americans, households, small businesses, countries around the world, pharmaceutical companies developing vaccines, our medical providers to ensure that they had the proper equipment to be able to serve and aid those impacted. And so our government's ability to respond and its ability to really finance that response is critical. We need to maintain that ability. It's really, though, when we get concerned that there could be some tipping point, if you will, where the amount of our debt will be so large that it will crowd out, essentially, our ability to respond. So why, then, do we see, why are these annual deficits these growing annual deficits the new norm? Why do we continually see headlines that the federal debt has reached and surpassed new level records? Well, the key driver is that the large majority of the federal budget is essentially on autopilot, and the primary driver being our rising healthcare costs. Americans are living longer. That is great. People are not having children as frequently as they did. The healthcare innovations that we've seen over the past years have created immense opportunities. Yet the federal government also is the largest provider of many of healthcare programs. And so we can see here that when we look at just the main cost drivers of really what is driving up this debt, we see major healthcare programs such as Medicare and Medicare and Medicaid, for example, really rising at rates far surpassing other government programs, with the exception of net interest. And so, we can certainly have a conversation about the need for cost containment in healthcare. Obviously, of course, this is a hot button issue in American politics, but also an opportunity too, where the public and the private sectors truly have an opportunity to work together and innovate to ensure that individuals who need who need affordable access to healthcare are able to get it. Another point that I would make here as well is that we see this kind of rising net interest cost kind of starting to crowd out other spending right here, this net interest. This is really important because this is just, think about if we're paying interest on our mortgage, interest on our credit card, right? That's just financing our ability to borrow. That's not going towards funding our schools, funding our roads. That is just paying back our creditors. And so as we think, certainly in the fiscal policy world, what we get nervous about is that there could be some point, whereas if we see net interest, for example, crowding out our ability to pay for other programs. I think it's really alarming to note that this year, more of your tax dollars are going to pay net interest than to pay our military. This year, more of your tax dollars are going to pay net interest than to pay for Medicare. That is something that I think we need to have a more fulsome discussion about with the public. We also see, and again, in Washington, it's easy for folks we see, the budget battles taking over the headlines, and that right now, for example, Congress is in deadlock debate over how to fund the government for the year. When we're thinking about kind of, whether or not you want to increase government spending or decrease the size of government, when we think about those budget battles that take place in Washington, that battle is just happening over this share of the pie, about 25% of what the government spends each year. The rest of these programs, they're effectively budgeted through a separate process called mandatory spending. They are pre-dictated by law. Congress does not need to annually rehash and re-argue the amount of spending that goes towards those programs. They're effectively predetermined and on autopilot. So you can understand when there's a lot of us in the fiscal policy world are kind of scratching our head when we have these budget battles and we're only talking about 25% of the federal budget. A very important 25% of the federal budget, of course, half of that going to funding our military and support for veterans. The rest of the funding our national parks, education. But it's really, when we talk about, it's really alarming, I think, when we look at the amount of the federal budget that is effectively no one's touching. It's just growing. And we're not doing anything about it. And so that's really where I think that, again, we need to be having, especially when we see headlines such as the two leading presidential candidates right now, effectively taking Social Security and Medicare off the table as even a discussion. It's not productive. So, we focused a lot so far on the spending side of the pie, right? But a lot of this is the fact that America's demographics are changing. I noted that folks are living longer. Folks are also not having as many kids. We've also discussed, again, in the headlines, the need for real immigration reform. And so the third takeaway I want to leave you with is the fact that we need more federal revenues to be able to meet today's fiscal priorities. So we've seen over time the widening between government spending and what we're bringing in tax revenues. Now, of course, as we all know, no one really likes to pay taxes, right? We all love a tax cut. We've seen tax cuts, of course, famously throughout history. Right now, the upcoming debate will be the fight over whether or not to extend the Trump tax cuts, similarly to the argument that we had at the expiration of the Bush tax cuts in the early 2010s. But it's important to really note that, especially on this projection, we're not projecting really any increase in revenue over time. It's really only on the spending side that we're starting to see, our cost containment is just, there is no cost containment. We're just going to keep spending. And so we really do need to focus on this revenue generation. And a lot of that is, I bring up here the composition of federal revenues because this is a really great way for us to kind of be thinking about how all of these issues are interrelated. Whether or not it's how we incentivize people to join the workforce, how we actually have a constructive conversation about immigration reform, that brings more tax revenue into the economy. How we think about, how has our economy changed, where we can think about, new sources of tax revenue. And a lot of that because the burden falls on all of us as taxpayers to fix this. You can see that from this chart, when we look at the composition of federal revenues, the majority of that revenue is coming from our individual taxes, the taxes that we pay, payroll taxes that fund Social Security and Medicare. Over time, we've seen kind of the composition of taxes paid from corporations decline. Now that's because, of course, we've seen the corporate tax rate decreased to because of global competition, kind of the race to the bottom, if you will, to ensure that U.S. businesses are as productive as possible. But also that we know that if corporations are taxed at a certain rate, they will just pass that tax on to owners of capital, to their laborers, to their consumers in the form of higher prices, depressed wages. And so it's really within how we change this composition, not necessarily how we change this composition, but how we expand the pie. How do we promote pro-growth tax policy that brings more individuals into the economy, that helps spur economic growth and production, investment in infrastructure, and innovative technologies that therefore then bring in more revenues. I also, I'd be remiss if I didn't really talk about, again, the impact of these demographic shifts that we've seen as a nation on the payroll tax revenue that we have coming in to fund two critical programs that Americans rely on and have earned. And that's, of course, the payroll taxes that fund Medicare and Social Security. Now, the reason I bring these up is because this is, I think, especially when we're here at the Dole Institute, Social Security reform, the third rail of American politics, right? It really wasn't, it hasn't been since the late Senator and Senator Moynihan courageously fought to reform the program in 1983 that we've had such constructive conversations on the program since. I was looking at the exhibit yesterday and reminded of a quote from the senator that said, in a time of need, the bridge between failure and success can be the government itself. And I think that when we think about Social Security, that's that was within the context that he gave those remarks, but that's what we're seeing play out in this moment. What I think is really alarming and what I don't think we talk about enough, what policymakers don't talk about enough, is if we choose to just let Social Security and Medicare remain on autopilot and not try to reform the programs to make them more solvent and ensure that benefits are supporting the individuals who need the most assistance, the programs themselves are going to be insolvent in the early 2030s. Medicare's primary trust fund will become insolvent in 2031. Social Security's primary trust fund in 2033. At that point, if the government chooses to do nothing, Social Security benefits will be cut across the board by nearly a quarter for all beneficiaries. So choosing to do nothing is choosing to cut the program. And so that's why we have an opportunity right now. Again, there are many of us sit here crunching these numbers, doing the math, trying to figure out how to strengthen these programs so that they are here for the long haul, so that America's retirees today can live their retirement with dignity and certainty that their benefits won't be cut, that folks who are just early in their careers understand the importance, the relevance, why we pay taxes, why the payroll tax is so critical, and why the value of work is so important. But it's really, because of the demographic changes that we've seen over time, this is why these programs are facing this financial shortfall. But of course, it's a very difficult issue to bring to the table because at the end of the day, the issues that face these programs are enormous, but they're also not mutually exclusive. We can strengthen them without ensuring that those who need these benefits won't be adversely harmed. Another point that I really wanted to bring up is, we get so locked in Washington, D.C. about the budget process and, what I like to say kind of just Congress's basic routine job, fund the government, right? Just do your budget homework. Well, in 1974, Congress reformed the budget process to put in a very orderly structural system whereby the president puts forth his vision for how government spending and tax generation should be allocated and collected across the federal government. Congress is then, through the budget committees, supposed to hold several hearings, public hearings about the budget, put forth a budget resolution so that the 12 appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate can have a fulsome debate throughout the summer, put forth appropriations bills that are then passed into law before the start of the fiscal year on October 1st. What I basically described sounds easy enough, right? Well, of course, here we see it on one slide, and it's quite complicated. The budget process is extraordinarily complex. And, even if I tried to make it sound simple there, does anyone know how many times Congress has actually followed through on its correct budget process since 1974? 4 times. Anyone know since the turn of the century? 0. Congress has routinely failed to follow its own budget homework rubric. Now, of course, as American taxpayers, we don't have that same luxury when it comes to our own household finances or setting our own family budget. Instead, Congress routinely finds itself in a situation where the start of the fiscal year comes on October 1st, and a budget has not been passed. And so what they do is they need to essentially kick the can down the road. Keep the government open and funding at last year's levels, and we'll get to that homework assignment when we can. So this is just showing you, really since 1977, the number of times that Congress has effectively done that. Just said, we're not going to get the budget done on time. We're just going to put forth a continuing resolution, keep the government funding at last year's levels, and get to this when we can. Now, the issue, of course, is that when Congress disagrees, we have government shutdowns if we can't get a continuing resolution passed and ready to go in time. Now, there are several partisan disagreements over, who's to blame for when the government shuts down, when the budget process doesn't work, when Congress isn't fully funded at the start of the fiscal year. But it's really the fact that, this is not one party's responsibility or one party to blame, but the fact that when we've had government shutdowns, when Democrats have been in control of the majority of the government, federal government, when Republicans have been, and then, of course, when we've seen divided government. And so, it's not a productive debate when we see one side blaming the other, but instead, especially in today's day and age when we have such slim margins of divided government and two-party control, that it behooves lawmakers to recognize that we have to work together. That's really the only way we can. And I will also note too that when we're talking about continuing resolutions and funding the government at last year's levels, it's sustainable for a short time. But if you have ever worked for the government, or we're talking about the inability for the Defense Department to then invest in a new program or defense capability that it had been planning for the next year, or for agencies to modernize, to begin critical infrastructure development that they had planned for in the coming year. And so while these ability to kind of keep the government open and running on autopilot can buy lawmakers time to finish those budget negotiations, it showcases that the process itself is broken, and yet it really does hinder our ability to get things done and to do, again, the basics of what voters depend their government to do, is to provide government services and programs, and the real certainty that they provide. Another note that I'll say too is that we've seen increasingly over the past decades certainly, but even really since the turn of the century, that we have a large amount of government spending happens outside kind of that normal budget process. We see headlines about supplemental funding to our allies abroad who are facing times of strife and war. Of course, their ability to respond to natural disasters across the nation. Their ability, for example, to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. All of this ability to, in a moment, come together to find ways to get funding out the door to support these causes, many have happened outside of the normal budget process. And so, and increasingly, we've seen a number of spending priorities go out through the reconciliation process in Congress, which is essentially a way to get partisan priorities through the budget process that aren't subject to the filibuster. And so we've seen about 22 reconciliation bills, I think, since 1974 that have gotten funding out. Now, of course, that has made for policy that then perhaps both parties do support. But the issue, of course, is that many of these bills, such as, for example, the Trump tax cuts that I'll discuss in the following few slides, it's put a lot of these policies on kind of like 10-year expiration windows, where households don't have a lot of certainty. We know that taxes will be cut for 10 years, and then at that point, there's going to just be kind of, again, this kicking the can down the road element where this is going to be a future Congress's issue to deal with, a future president's issue to deal with. And that creates a tremendous amount of political uncertainty and, of course, economic uncertainty when we're trying to project what the federal deficit and the federal debt will look like and the amount of revenue that we're going to need to generate to be able to help close that gap. So I'll leave with this last takeaway, because this is what here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, what we're doing a lot of work on preparing for, is that we have an election this year. It's going to be a pretty contentious election, a lot of uncertainty, but 2025 is going to be akin to kind of the 2012 fiscal cliff. We have a number of fiscal policy deadlines that await in 2025 that Congress is not going to have the luxury to kick the can down the road on. So I'm going to walk through some of these and then we'll open it up for any questions and discussion. But I like to think of, we've seen some lawmakers kind of discuss 2025 as like the next, the fiscal policy Super Bowl. In DC, we don't have a really strong football team, so we have to kind of think of these, policy analogies to make up for that. But first and foremost, when whoever wins the election, whatever the division of Congress is going to look like in the House and the Senate, and whoever has party control, the one thing we know is certain is that the federal debt limit is going to be reinstated on January 2nd of 2025. Now, the debt limit is set by law, and it restricts really the total amount of money that the federal government is legally able to borrow. So in those first slides, I kind of showed that we are consistently running deficits. Well, to finance that deficit, we issue Treasury securities, and Treasury is able to issue those securities and to proceed with that borrowing, but up until a limit. Congress sets the power of the purse. Congress sets, after 1917, Congress determined that they would allow Treasury to have that authority. Treasury didn't need to come to Congress every single time it needed to borrow, but instead they would occasionally have to kind of check and balance each other, if you will. Go back to Congress every few years when that debt limit was hit. So this has been the norm over the past century, but it's really over the past 12 years that we've seen political polarization around the debt limit really intensify. And so on January 2nd, the debt limit will be reinstated, And I'm not going to read through all of this, but this is just to kind of really showcase that over the past 12 years, when the United States has come face to face with staring down the debt limit and hoping not to default on our obligations, that the Congress waits till the 11th hour to figure out a way forward. In 2011, it was really hours until the Treasury Department predicted that we were not going to have enough revenue coming in a day to be able to to pay all of our bills in full and on time. And we've seen really over the past years that regardless of which party is in power in the White House and in Congress, that it's really up until the 11th hour that lawmakers wait to find a solution forward. And that the debt limit is increasingly kind of being used as a political leverage, if you will, to get other policy priorities, to have the debate about government spending, to have the debate about tax revenues. And so we know, for example, that in 2025, the debt limit is going to be coming back. So this is an area that BPC does a tremendous amount of research on. We are kind of the independent estimator, if you will, of looking at those daily Treasury statements, looking at what bills the government's paying that day, where the tax revenue and other sources of revenue are coming in the door, and trying to give the public and policymakers an understanding of, number one, the urgency with which Congress needs to address this issue by raising the debt limit or suspending it for a period of time, and also the kind of a clock, if you will, as to how long they have in their negotiations until we're in a kind of that red zone where we are staring down, defaulting on our obligations for truly the first time in modern history. Now, what makes this issue so hard for folks to understand in other countries is that the United States is the holder of the world's reserve currency. We have the strongest economy. We can borrow at costs lower than any other nation, and we never have to worry about kind of our ability to access those capital markets and raise the debt limit. Yet politically, we do. Politically, every few years, we are flirting with the chance of defaulting on those obligations, putting ourselves in a category that is just really unheard of for the world's largest economy. And this is why, too, we have seen increasingly over the past decade, response from, we've seen a reaction in the Treasury markets as to, whether or not the United States is truly the safest place to, Treasury securities are truly the safest investment. And we've also seen on the global scale, ratings agencies such as S&P and Fitch cite our complex budget process, our unsustainable fiscal outlook, and our inability to come together to do something as sensible as raising the debt limit in an orderly, timely fashion, really spook the global economy and investors. And so this is an area that we're going to be doing a lot of research on in the coming year. But I think that it was really fascinating last summer when, in the height of, we had this debate over the debt limit last summer, as some of you may recall, and at the time, former Speaker McCarthy and President Biden were able to find a deal to push the debt limit, to suspend it until early 2025. But really what that just did was it really put this now on the shoulders of whoever comes into power. This is going to be, the debt limit will be reinstated during the lame duck. Treasury will have a number of months to kind of help buy some time through some powers that the Treasury Secretary has, but we're talking again, even if it's not, if it's a new administration or kind of a new cabinet makeup, this is we know for certain that this is going to be the first fiscal challenge that will await the next administration and the next Congress. We also know too that, again, back on the negotiation table are going to be just the routine budget homework assignment of the government. We are halfway through fiscal year 2024. We still don't have a fiscal year 2024 budget, which means that in a year from now, who knows? Congress might be debating halfway through fiscal year 2025 and still debating its budget. Hopefully they're not. Hopefully they've gotten their act together and they're starting to debate the 2026 appropriations, but not super certain of that yet. We also know that there is going to be a debate over expanding some of the premium tax credits that were recently extended in the some legislation last year. So that's going to be those premium tax credits to make healthcare access more affordable for millions of Americans will expire in the middle of 2025. We also know that in the package of about $3 trillion in tax cuts that went into law under President Trump will expire at the end of 2025. And Congress has really no plan right now as to how it's going to grapple with those. Now, of course, the majority of these tax cuts that will expire are tax cuts that will impact individuals. Many of the provisions that were put into law about a decade ago for the business side of the tax code, many of which were made permanent. But who's to say, again, new Congress, new administration, what that makeup will be like. But this is what we're concerned about because, number one, taxpayers deserve certainty. They need to know what tax rate their income is going to be taxed at, for their own financial planning. But we also know, too, as we're thinking about the broader fiscal outlook, right now, all of these projections assume that these tax cuts will expire. Politically, letting tax cuts expire, that's very, close to saying politically impossible, right? So we only know that those deficit projections right now are probably going to look even worse, in 2 years' time from now. And the last point that I will make here as well as we're looking at the 2025 fiscal calendar is that there's also a global tax agreement in the works that the OECD and the G20 countries, along with about, I think, 132 countries have signed on to rolling out a series of tax agreements that will help kind of share and redistribute global profits and make and eliminate the ability for tax havens to really pull corporate resources from countries where their customer base and their tax liability exists. And so, for example, one of the main points of this agreement is that countries who have signed on to this agreement agree to implement a minimum global corporate income tax of 15%. So that corporations cannot take advantage of all the deductions and expenditures and credits that would allow them to basically pay an effective corporate tax rate below that 15%. That 15% will be the new base rate for the majority of countries across the globe. As one can imagine, the United States signed on to this agreement under the Biden administration, and in Congress there is absolutely no consensus over how we are going to face compliance in 2025. We are seeing proposals anywhere from instituting another global trade war to wanting to even collect tax revenues even above and beyond that 15%. And so both sides of the aisle are really digging their heels into the ground. These conversations have barely even begun. But we know that because compliance is staring us down in 2025, this is why, again, regardless of all of the uncertainty that we see this year in the elections and the political polarization that has really become the central focal point of the budget process, that 2025 is going to give lawmakers, this is why we call this the Super Bowl of fiscal policy. I mean, this is, or fiscal Armageddon, however, pessimistic or optimistic you want to be, but there's no really getting around these issues. Now, of course, Congress could find ways to kick the can down the road and have these discussions, extend these provisions and have the discussions at a later date, but we know that these issues are going to be front and center. And, I note here, what else? These are also where we're going to be another 18, 24 months closer to that impending insolvency of Social Security and Medicare. We're going to have, immigration and border security are still going to be top of mind issues. We're still going to have this debate over how we make higher education affordable and accessible for the next generation. So these other big, broad, hard fiscal policy issues are still going to be dominating the candidates' platforms this year. And then, of course, kind of the fighting for that same fiscal share of the pie in 2025. And so, I promised that I would leave with some optimism. But, I think it's important to note that fiscal policy is the balance of short-term priorities, political priorities, and long-run economic costs, that the vast majority of folks who work in this area agree that debts and deficits do matter. How we find the solutions to overcome those issues are different, but that there is a way, and even just walking through the halls here, such optimism to show that that political courage can exist, and that we can find ways to overcome these challenges, and that if we don't try to curb the amount of debt that we are issuing every year, that those net interest costs, that just our ability to finance that spending and to pay back our creditors, be them American taxpayers and foreign central banks, there can be a point where they will just crowd out other critical spending that we need to invest in our country. And so, a lot of these questions that we're grappling with, what is that tipping point? Where do we start? Do we start with entitlement reform? Do we start with making higher education more affordable? Immigration reform? Certainly don't have the answers, but I think that this is too where we look to voters to engage. And what is the appropriate path for the U.S. fiscal outlook? And how do we take default off the table? At BPC, we have a number of different ways for the public to engage on some of these thorny issues, like trying to balance the budget. So we have this budget simulator where you can go online and share with your policymaker, how you would reform our education spending, how you would reform the tax code to ensure that we're generating enough revenue. And then we also have, that we just launched last week, this ability for you to see where your hard-earned tax dollars go in the government. You get a receipt for when you go out to dinner, but you don't get a receipt every time that you file your taxes. And so, you deserve as an American taxpayer to know, how much of my income is funding the National Park Program, how much of my income is funding Medicare and SNAP benefits. So it's a really cool tool, and encourage you to visit our website, bipartisanpolicy.org, where we have a number of resources, not only on these tools and what I discussed, but really across fiscal policy, energy, education, democracy, healthcare, housing policy, just to name a few. So with that, I'll leave it open for any question and answers, and happy to stick around for a while.
My question is, I consider 62 to be too young for people to be retiring. Okay, that's just my personal belief. But no one has raised that number up higher to like 65. Mm-hmm. They raised the other ages up higher. Is anybody in Washington talking about just raising that one number up? And have you done any statistical work of what kind of money that would save the government? Or does it not save very much?
So there is a lot of work being done. It's, I would say that, again, touching Social Security it's politically so difficult. But there is a lot of research that's being done about educating the public about delaying Social Security benefits. So right, at 62 you can start you can start claiming, but if you can afford to delay claiming, your benefit is larger. And so that's where I actually think that there's actually a lot of work, some bipartisan legislation that was introduced just last year that focuses on the fact that if we can get that information out to the public better, to really educate about the benefits of claiming later when you can. But also to your point, yes, phasing in, gradually raising those ages is certainly, I think, it's all about the messaging and the phasing in. But if we start to have those conversations now, it's both fiscally responsible. So there are certainly conversations, but we haven't seen actually any legislation introduced. But right now, a lot of that focus has been on kind of the public education of the benefits of delaying.
You want to hold it, okay, great. I might drop it. I think it was 2012, President Obama came up with a bipartisan committee to work on what are we going to do to work on these issues. I think it was headed by Senator Lott. They actually came up with something, and then President Obama said, I can't accept that. George Will recently wrote an article saying, you're never going to pass anything unless you have a separate commission that is separate from Congress, and they vote yes, no, and they can't alter it. What is the possibility of that actually happening, since even President Obama would not approve it?
Yeah, so we saw the Simpson-Bowles Commission come about from those negotiations, which we actually saw some aspects put into law, such as some of the discretionary, the caps on that 25% of the budget growth over those 10 years. Right now, there's actually discussions in Congress about standing up another fiscal commission. There's been bipartisan legislation that was introduced last fall in both the House and the Senate that would do just that. They would kind of reconstitute a new fiscal commission that's made up of members of Congress and then also members from the general public. The bills differ in kind of whether or not those non-voting members from the public have voting or non-voting rights. But there's certainly a lot of momentum, I'd say, if you will, around the potential of bringing back a fiscal commission. Now, I would note that the success of such a commission, I think, given our fiscal outlook, is not necessarily finding, the $7 trillion of cuts within the budget, but what are really the policy options on the table that both sides can agree to just get the conversation starting, right? Like, how do you get some incremental wins, like just putting forth options to not necessarily make Social Security solvent for the next 75 years, but just for the next 20 years, right? And so, I'm definitely encouraged to see the momentum and the discussions coming out of Congress. Now, of course, getting this type of legislation passed is difficult. We have seen, folks on both sides of the aisle say that this is another fiscal commission, might not be successful, but I am enthused by at least the fact that we do have, it's first and foremost part of the discussion in Congress, and that we have, and on both sides of the aisle, but that right now, given the funding deadlines that await Congress, right now they're looking at March 1st and March 8th as the next opportunity to really hash out the budget. Those could potentially be windows where, again, this discussion comes up, but that's difficult in an election year. But
Thank you. A follow-up to the last man's question. Some years ago, it was needed to decide which military bases should be reallocated and closed. And Congress set up a commission to identify the bases to be closed or reallocated. And it was simply an up or down vote by Congress. And I think a congressman has, at least one member of Congress has proposed a similar process for maybe Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. It seems like that would be a good way to go. because the federal tax code, income tax code, was probably written by the mob. We just have to have some process that doesn't get entangled in the individual members of Congress's priorities. A good example would be the Postal Service. Mm-hmm. The Postal Service can't close a post office because the Congress just, go bananas. But if they had an independent body that says, here are the postal offices that should be closed and the ones that should be kept open, and Congress could be vote or down, then that would take it out of the politics.
Yeah, so that's the BRAC-style commission, that exactly kind of focusing on that up or down. I think the only challenge is how lawmakers to have that up and down vote, they need to first agree that everything is on the table, right? It can't just be how we're going to look at the tax code. It can't just be what programs we're going to cut. Getting to that point in today's day and age is very difficult. Also, I think what, even if eventually that is the structure, where I think a lot of the difficulty lies is, allowing lawmakers to have those private, behind closed doors convenings, the ability to really, in good faith, hash out these issues, but then also how they communicate it to the public. These types of commissions work well when the public is engaged, when the public understands the issues at hand and has a say in helping shape those. But agree. I mean, the BRAC-style commission is very successful and certainly front and center in a lot of the conversations right now.
It was mentioned early on that the student group last night had some really good ideas, and I'm really kind of curious to know what this next generation that will be really impacted, what their ideas were about how to fix this problem.
Yeah. Well, I'd say first and foremost, they are very pessimistic that Social Security is going to be around for them. So a lot of discussion about kind of how we sustainably finance the program. We had a really great discussion about tax revenue and how to ensure that the tax system is set up to be progressive and is supportive of not only the next generation, the getting our economy on the right fiscal foot, but that it is supporting individuals that need the most assistance. We had a great discussion on our defense capabilities and the fact that defense technology is changing, our defense readiness, with the role of technology, of course, discussion on nuclear weapon capabilities, and lastly, too, that what was really fascinating is that the students didn't want to change the social safety net. There were areas where they wanted to actually increase some support for individuals who need the most assistance, but that a lot of discussion on kind of program efficacy and that programs, to ensure that programs that are working well are sustained and adequately funded. Emily, was there another point that I should raise from that discussion last night? Yeah. So we had, and then also too, actually there was a lot more, folks wanted to invest more resources in research and development around healthcare. So looking really at vaccine development and some of the investing in efficient uses of healthcare technology. So really bright, inquisitive minds who are really eager to get out there and who know a lot about how the government works. And so it was really exciting, yeah.
Just a quick question. Regardless of where you stand on politics, personally, do you see these critical issues being faced until the voters feel some pain because of the debt to get their attention?
It's an excellent question. You know, I think that certainly, so with regards to Social Security and Medicare, yes, I think that we won't have serious discussions about reform until we are probably staring down the fact that benefits could be cut, you know, as early as the 2030s. I think when it comes to the issue of the debt, and you know, we have a lot of these discussions about net interest crowding out other national priorities, or you know, some tipping point where foreign investors don't want to buy Treasury securities, so it makes the cost of borrowing more expensive, and then you know, could invite room for another country to, you know, challenge the U.S. as the reserve currency. I think that those are very abstract concepts, right? And I really don't think that it is until we start to see interest rates or, you know, that the cost of borrowing really hurt American pocketbooks, or the impact that rising interest rates and the cost of borrowing will crowd out private capital when employers are no longer able to invest productively in employment, in new factories, in new productive capabilities. I think that that's really where we're going to start to see the impacts. When that happens, kind of what level that tipping point is, that's what's really difficult. And the reason why that's so difficult is because over the past 10, 15 years, the cost of borrowing has been so low. And so we just don't, that is a big unknown, but I think you're exactly right. It's not going to be until the voters really understand the pain, and that's going to, of course, be different across each household.
I guess in my mind, this is mainly a political issue, mainly because to get things done, you're going to have to put pressure on your individual representative to do it. I've dealt with our representative, Mr. Mann, and I mean, he gives you sound bites, and we really have no influence on him because of gerrymandering, and also the fact that he listens to, you know, national things and the political parties and not us. So I guess as an individual voter, how do we put pressure on someone like that to do what he should be doing, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of it too is, I wish I had the answer. Yeah, it is tough, and I think, you know, I think of a lot of the work that we do at the Bipartisan Policy Center as, you know, we're kind of the lobbyist on behalf of the American people, right? We don't take policy positions based on we'll only support legislation that has strong bipartisan footing. But I also think it's why, you know, for us, it's having these conversations, it's getting out to, you know, all politics is local, right? And it's,
that kind of where the gerrymandering comes in.
Exactly.
It's almost impossible, and so you can't get a Republican out of office, even if he's,
Yeah, no, it's, we'll have to see. My democracy colleagues are here next week, so I might make you ask them that question too. But no, it's also, you know, an issue that we face in just trying to get something, you know, in Congress. Like all of these programs and policies are spread across different committees with different jurisdictions, and so it's really hard to have these kinds of conversations about, you know, like improving the education system or improving economic security when everyone has their own kind of fiefdom or some note of power.
I love graphs and charts.
Thank you.
And you know, there was one line that kind of got me, and that was the payroll tax line, the revenue. It's flat line, basically. And you know, what I keep thinking of is you keep hearing about the wealth gap in the United States. So, you know, we have a gentleman a few miles north of here in Omaha who says he pays a lower tax rate, you know, than his administrative assistant.
Yep.
And so I keep wondering about the whole, you know, wealth gap, and there's so much money there. You know, I don't know, you talked about a corporate tax. Is there such a thing as the wealth tax that's coming into play, or, but it seems like this wealth gap keeps getting bigger.
Yeah, so there are definitely discussions about kind of the constitutionality of imposing a wealth gap, a tax. In our budget simulator, you can play around with, introducing a wealth tax. I think that in the current day and age in the political climate, it's a very hard hill to climb. But I will say that, especially with regards to the payroll tax, for individuals who are earning over, I think it's $160,000, that income is not taxed on payroll taxes. That's the taxable maximum that individuals face. You know, we all, if you're, all of our income is taxed and to fund Social Security and Medicare. But if for those dollars earned over $160,000, that revenue is not taxed. I think getting at that point about the wealth gap, why is that the case? Why can't income over that threshold also be subject to tax? Now, of course, there's discussions too about how then you ensure that Social Security program, for example, is therefore benefiting individuals who rely on Social Security, whereas your dear friend just north probably doesn't need that Social Security check, right, in retirement. So a lot of discussions about how to make, again, the program more solvent, and also then more better targeted. But it's an excellent question.
Has the bipartisan commission formulated a plan that could be suggested to Congress
On
all these issues?
All of these issues. I think that's my job security right there, right? So we do work on a number of these issues. I'd say, first and foremost, we are doing a lot of work kind of helping understand whether or not, what could a potential fiscal commission, this decade could be set up for success to do. We have put out a number of research proposals on how to sustainably reform Medicare and Social Security, which are available on our websites. And again, kind of ensuring that these programs remain solvent, remain here for the future, but also are ensuring that folks who need access to them are getting so and are able to sustain their livelihoods on with that support. We've done a number of work on helping to support kind of pro-growth, pro-worker tax reform as well. And then on the debt limit, we really are seeing kind of the objective independent estimator in Washington to help lawmakers really decide or really understand how long they have until the United States is staring down a potential financial default. So we've worked on a lot of these issues, and that's just really in the economic and the healthcare space, but we're doing a lot of work as well on energy innovation and energy and climate policy, as well as on, in the thick of helping across the country prepare election workers for the upcoming election, helping train them and ensure that our election integrity and our democracy is as strong as ever going into the upcoming elections. So, done a lot of work.
Rachel, thank you so much for being with us today. We'll get your question right after. Thank you, everybody. I want to be sure, that was just a wonderful discussion. I want to be sure and thank someone who's been instrumental in building this partnership with the Bipartisan Policy Center, our friend John Richter, who's the director of a congressional project at BPC and former chief of staff to Senator Olympia Snowe. John, thank you so much for making this happen for us and for bringing Katie Harbath last fall, and we look forward to so much. So please, everybody, and join me in thanking John. Have a great afternoon. It's so good to see you here at the Dole Institute. We look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Okay, so you're
So we're 100%
not-for-profit.
100% nonprofit.
Yeah.
Yes, we do.
Cindy.